The Jetsons was not a show about the future. Everyone who has ever written about it has called it a show about the future, and everyone who has ever written about it has been wrong. The future was the costume. Underneath the jet cars and the robot maid and the push-button apartment in the sky was something that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with the specific anxieties of American life in 1962. The fear of being replaced, the exhaustion of keeping up appearances, the quiet desperation of a man who has everything the post-war dream promised and still cannot shake the feeling that something essential is missing. The Jetsons did not predict the future. It diagnosed the present. And the diagnosis was so accurate that it has remained relevant across 6 decades that have changed almost everything else about how Americans live. That is not what cartoons are supposed to do. That is what the Jetsons did anyway. And the story of how and why it did it is far more interesting than any flying car. To understand what made the Jetsons revolutionary, you have to understand what American television looked like in September 1962 when the show premiered on ABC. The dominant form of entertainment in primetime was the family sitcom, and the family sitcom of that era operated on a set of assumptions so rigid and so unexamined that they had become invisible to the people making the shows, and to most of the people watching them. The father went to work. The mother managed the home. The children caused small problems that were resolved within 22 minutes. The house was always clean. The marriage was always stable. The finances were never discussed in ways that suggested genuine strain. And the underlying message of every episode of every show operating within this framework was that the life being depicted was the correct life and that anyone watching who was not living it had fallen short of the standard. Hanna-Barbera looked at this landscape and made a decision that was either genuinely subversive or accidentally profound, depending on how generously you want to interpret the motivations of a production company trying to sell advertising space. They took the family sitcom format and moved it 60 years into the future. And in doing so, they created enough distance from the present that they could show their audience things about the present that the present was not yet ready to see directly. George Jetson was the post-war American dream father transported into a world where technology had solved every material problem and he was still exhausted. He still dreaded going to work. His boss still made him feel small and replaceable. His children still grew up faster than he could follow. His wife still managed the domestic sphere with a competence that he took for granted because taking it for granted was what the role of husband in that era required. The flying car did not fix any of this. The robot maid did not fix any of this. The push-button apartment in the sky did not fix any of this. And that was the joke. And underneath the joke was the most honest observation that American primetime television had made about the post-war suburban dream in the decade since the dream had been delivered. George Jetson's job at Spacely Space Sprockets deserves more serious attention than it has ever received as a piece of social commentary. George worked 1 hour a day 2 days a week, and he found it completely exhausting. The writers constructed this detail as a joke about laziness, and it functioned perfectly as a joke about laziness. But the observation sitting inside the joke was something sharper. If you removed every material obstacle from a human being's working life, if you reduced the labor requirement to its absolute minimum and automated everything that could be automated, the psychological experience of the workplace would remain as draining as it had always been because the draining part was never the physical labor. It was the hierarchy. It was Mr. Spacely screaming and threatening termination. It was the performance of competence required by the presence of an authority who held your livelihood in his hands. It was the specific indignity of a grown adult having to justify his existence to someone whose power over him was arbitrary and total. The future had not fixed this because the future could not fix this. It was a human problem, and technology does not fix human problems. It gives them new settings. Rosie the robot maid is the character in the Jetsons who has been most consistently misread across 60 years of cultural commentary. The standard interpretation is that Rosie represents the liberation of the housewife, technology finally doing the domestic labor that women had been expected to perform for centuries. This interpretation is incomplete in a way that matters. Rosie did not liberate Jane Jetson. Rosie replaced the physical labor of housework without changing the social expectations surrounding it. Jane still managed the household. She still supervised Rosie. She still made the decisions about what the home needed and when it needed it and how it should be organized and what her family required on any given day. The cognitive and emotional labor of domestic life remained entirely hers. What Rosie changed was the physical execution. What Rosie did not change was who was responsible for the execution being correct. This is a precise description of what household technology has actually done for domestic labor across the past century. And the Jetsons described it in 1962 with more accuracy than most serious sociological writing on the subject managed in the same period. The character of Judy Jetson is where the show was most openly in conversation with anxieties that 1962 American culture preferred not to examine directly. Judy was 15 years old and completely consumed by boys and music and social status, and the desperate need to be seen as sophisticated by her peers. Her parents found her mystifying. Her preoccupations seemed trivial to the adults around her. Her emotional intensity about things that George and Jane could not fully take seriously was a recurring source of comedy and a recurring source of genuine frustration that the show mostly played for laughs without fully acknowledging the seriousness of what it was depicting. A teenager who cannot make her parents understand what matters to her and parents who cannot make their teenager understand what they are worried about is not a story about the future. It is a story about every family in every decade, and the Jetsons told it with enough honesty that the laughter it produced had something real underneath it. The technology that the Jetsons depicted is the part of the show that attracts the most attention in retrospect, because some of it turned out to be prescient in ways that feel remarkable, and some of it turned out to be completely wrong in ways that feel equally remarkable. Video calling, which the show depicted as a routine domestic technology, is now so ordinary that a child in 2024 cannot conceive of it as a novelty. Flat-screen televisions, smartwatches, automated treadmills, moving sidewalks in airports, home treadmills, robotic vacuums. Each of these appeared in the Jetsons before they existed in the world, and each of them is now so embedded in ordinary life that their novelty has completely evaporated. The show was not making predictions. It was extrapolating from trajectories that were already visible in 1962, and the trajectories it identified correctly were the ones that followed from the basic human desire to make physical labor less physically demanding. Where the Jetsons was wrong was in assuming that the social structures surrounding the technology would transform along with the technology itself. The flying cars never arrived. More significantly, the leisure society never arrived. George Jetson worked 1 hour a day 2 days a week and found it exhausting, and the joke of that has only gotten sharper with time because the average American worker in 2024 works more hours than their counterpart in 1962, despite having access to technology that would have seemed miraculous to a person living in that year. The show's single-season original run and the circumstances of its cancellation tell a story about the television industry of 1962 that is as interesting as anything in the show itself. ABC placed the Jetsons in primetime on Sunday evenings, and the ratings were genuinely competitive in the first weeks. The problem was not the audience. The problem was NBC, which was broadcasting the wonderful world of Disney in color in the same time slot. In 1962, color television was a genuine differentiator. Families who had invested in color sets, and there were enough of them to matter in the ratings calculation, wanted to watch something that used color as more than a technical fact. Disney in color on NBC was a more attractive option than the Jetsons in the same slot regardless of the quality of the content, because the experience of watching color television was itself still novel enough to be a draw. The Jetsons was canceled after 24 episodes for competitive reasons that had almost nothing to do with the show's actual quality and almost everything to do with the specific moment in television technology that it occupied. What followed the cancellation was the strangest part of the story. The 24 episodes that ABC had decided were insufficient to sustain a primetime series turned out to be more than sufficient to sustain a cultural phenomenon. The show went into syndication and into Saturday morning rotation and found new audiences every year for 2 decades. Children who had not been alive when the original episodes aired grew up with the Jetsons as a fixture of their Saturday mornings and experienced it as a permanent thing rather than a canceled experiment. By the time Hanna-Barbera revived the show with new episodes in 1985, the original 24 had been in continuous circulation for 23 years, and the generation that had grown up watching them was old enough to have children who were watching them too. The show had achieved something that successful shows in competitive primetime rarely achieve because they are never given the circumstances to achieve it. It had become inevitable. It had become the kind of thing that seemed like it had always existed. The 1987 theatrical film and the revival series of the mid-1980s were competent expansions of the world without being genuine additions to it. They gave audiences who loved the characters more time with those characters, and they did it without embarrassing the original. But the specific quality that had made the original 24 episodes worth remembering, the precise social observation sitting underneath the comedy of technological anachronism, was not present in the revival material with the same consistency. The original had been made by people who were using the prehistoric future as a tool for examining the present they were living in. The revival was made by people using a beloved property as a tool for continuing something audiences wanted to continue. These are different projects, and they produce different results. What the Jetsons actually did that no one has given it proper credit for was demonstrate that the family sitcom format contained more critical potential than anyone in the American television industry of 1962 was willing to acknowledge. By moving the format 60 years forward in time, Hanna-Barbera created a version of the domestic comedy that could say things about domestic life that the domestic comedy set in the present was not permitted to say. George Jetson's Exhaustion was more legible as a commentary on post-war masculinity because it was set in a future that had removed every legitimate excuse for exhaustion. Rosie's Existence was more legible as a commentary on the actual nature of domestic labor, because the automation she represented made visible what was still being asked of Jane even after the physical work was removed. Judy's Alienation was more legible as a commentary on the communication failures between generations, because the technology that surrounded the family made it impossible to blame those failures on external circumstances. The future stripped away the excuses, and what remained was the human material that the excuses had been covering. That is why the Jetsons were more revolutionary than you think, not because they predicted video calls or smartwatches or robotic vacuums, because they looked at the present with enough honesty to see what it actually was, and then dressed that honesty in a costume of technological optimism that made it safe to broadcast on a Friday night in 1962. The costume was the flying cars, the honesty was everything else, and 60 years later the honesty is what remains.